Welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Stories of Determination. I'm your host, Betsy Graziani Fospender. Like in nature, we see determined flowers and vines clinging to life and seeking light. So are Morning Glory people. And in this podcast, I'll interview writers, activists, artists, entrepreneurs, survivors and thrivers, and trailblazers of all kinds. These are folks that have been determined to get over, under, around, and through the obstacles that face them, or to seize the opportunities that come before them. I find these people inspiring and amazing. I know you will too. Today it is my honor and my thrill to welcome to the Morning Glory Project, Hollye Dexter. She is the author of the memoir Fire Season, My Journey from Ruin to Redemption, a novel called Better Off Without You, and co-edited the anthology Dancing at the Shame Prom. She's written extensively about gun violence and feminism, her essays being featured in anthologies and her articles at Marie Shriver's Architects of Change, Writer's Digest, The Feminist Wire, Scary Mommy, and others. Having experienced gun violence in her own family, Hollye is a dedicated activist for gun reform, using her voice and her writing to advocate for change. With Women Against Gun Violence, she's lobbied for stronger gun laws, both locally and in D.C., meeting with members of Congress, speaking at City Hall, as well as at rallies, in schools, churches, and temples. Her work as an activist has been covered extensively on all kinds of media. In 2003, she founded the award-winning nonprofit Art and Soul, providing arts programs for teenagers in the foster care system and intergenerational programs that paired at-risk youth with senior citizens. As president of the Music Heals Foundation, she worked with Denise Brown, Nicole Brown's sister, raising funds for domestic violence shelters and providing music therapy for autistic children at Cal State University Northridge. Her motivation is to end gun violence and to leave behind a better world for her 3 children, and I'll add her grandchild as well. You can learn more about Hollye at hollyedexter.net, and that's spelled Hollye Dexter.net. Hollye, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Betsy, one of my favorite people on the planet.
and you one of mine. So, Hollye, we are recording this. You know, when you and I initially set this conversation up, of course, our focus was gun violence, and I still want to spend some time talking about that. But we're also recording this in the middle of the coronavirus shutdown, where we're all homebound and trying to do what we can to stay safe, to protect our neighbors, to provide for our families, and to care for our communities. So I think that we can't ignore what our environment is right now. So we'll bounce around from a few topics. But because of that, I wanted to talk to you about this. Fire Season. Tell our listeners the story of what Fire Season is about.
Okay, I will try to encapsulate it. In 1994, our home caught fire in the middle of the night while we were sleeping. It was just a freak thing with electrical wiring. By the time that we woke up, the entire house was engulfed in flames, and we were on the second story and literally had seconds to kick windows and screens out and jump from second story windows. I had my 4-year-old son. Our daughter was at a sleepover at a relative's house that night, thank God. But I had our 4-year-old son, and we had to get out these windows. We had 2 home-based businesses that we were running. My husband had a recording studio, and I had a national children's clothing line that I was right in the middle of shipping our spring season. Everything burned down in 20 minutes, our home, all of our possessions, and both of our jobs. So within 20 minutes, we were homeless and unemployed. And so it opens with that scene, and then we're in the hospital and they're saying, okay, you can go home now. And we have nowhere to go. And, and it goes on from there. So basically the story is about how we took what was a blank slate. It was like, my husband said it this way, it was like somebody took the Etch-a-Sketch of our lives and shook it, and what are you going to create with this blank slate now,
Well, and the reason I initially wanted to talk to you about that is because First of all, you and I both live in California, you in Southern Cal and me in Northern California. And we've witnessed a few fire seasons where lots of people have lost their homes. Yours was as a result of an electrical fire, but and that was 1994. So it was kind of before the fire season has gotten as bad as it has in recent years due to climate change and other factors. So I know that there are lots of people that have had devastation in their lives of one kind or another, whether it's their home being burned down or whether it's a tragic loss of a family member or a job failure or a layoff or whatever hardship they might go through. And they just don't think they can get through it. And I want to talk to you about how you did, because not only did you lose your home and your businesses, but your pets, as well as you got to discover in the aftermath who your friends really were and who they weren't. Yeah. It wasn't just the house that burned down. Can you say a bit about that and then kind of what lessons you learned during that process?
Yeah. So fire season opens basically with the fire. That's the first scene. And what happens in the several years after is that our luck just got worse and worse and worse. Our really close friends at first were really great for the first couple of months, but then we were losers. We were just these people down on our luck, and people just started to distance themselves with us as though what we had was contagious. And so we lost most of our really close friends. We didn't have jobs. We were just really struggling. We were in our early 30s. And so after that, other people started to pop up in those empty seats that our quote unquote close friends once held. And those people who came into our lives at that time are still our closest friends to this day, so we really got to learn a lot about people, but we also had a run of really bad luck with, we finally, our communities stepped up and raised money for us so we could get into a rental home. And we were in a house that it was a lease to own. And we had already put like $14,000 down on a down payment on the house, and we were paying toward it. And those landlords ripped us off. They had never paid the bank and pocketed all our money. We got evicted. Then we moved into another rental house. Same thing that landlord did. We got evicted again. So we just kept experiencing like shady characters. It was just this period where it was like we just couldn't win. When you thought like the worst thing that had happened, it's like, hold my beer. Here's the next year,
Well, I think about that. I've been kind of thinking about that since I knew I was going to have you as a guest today. And I was thinking about how, when somebody experiences a tragedy in their lives, how people at first are, kindly and generously there for them.
Right. It's called the honeymoon period of tragedy, right? The honeymoon period.
Yeah, maybe so. But it almost seems like there's an expiration date, like a date by which you were supposed to kind of be over it.
Exactly.
And I think that we do that when somebody has lost a child or a pregnancy or their home or whatever. And it seems like, hey, I'm there and I'm bringing over the casseroles and all that at that first couple of weeks. And then, we kind of expect you to be able to just kind of move on from it and be back to what you were.
And also I recognize that people do need to get on with their own lives. They can't make saving you their full-time occupation,
No.
So they do have to get back to their own lives at a certain time. And so you do have to sort of find the strength to piece it together and go on. But I mean, in some instances, people were just really selfish and awful with us. But in other instances, I recognize that everybody has their own stuff to deal with,
Well, that's a difference. So let me clarify what I mean by that. I'm not talking about people that, don't have time to come and hold your hand every day.
Yeah.
But I'm talking about people that get impatient with you, sort of.
Yeah.
Feeling like, aren't you over this yet?
Right.
So, and I know that that's been true for loved ones and people that I know who have had a tragic loss in their family due to suicide or gun violence or those kinds of things. And somebody's like, well, gosh, I mean, she died 6 years ago, for Pete's sake. When are you going to move on?
Exactly.
So that's more what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about people that, have to, they're still lovingly with you when they need to be, but but they also had to, get back to work and do the things that they need to do. I'm talking about people that sort of feel impatient with the fact that some of these things live in you for a very long time, if not forever to some degree.
Yeah. And well, again, I feel like people are afraid of what happens to you when you're going through a really horrible situation. They're afraid that it could happen to them. And so they need to say something to sort of wrap it up in a bow and make it okay. I mean, so many people, and I wrote a whole thing about this in fire season. So many people said to us, well, thank God you're okay. That's all that matters. And everything else is just stuff. And I get why they were saying that, because they wanted to feel better about it. But it's just stuff unless it's your stuff. And, and it's not just stuff when it's all your pets, which was the worst part of it for us, that we couldn't get back in to save them. And that it's, your sense of safety, your sense of home, everything you ever built, every memory you ever made, your family heirlooms, all your photo op, it's everything. It's your wedding dress that you were preserving for your daughter to wear one day. It's, and that's all, that is stuff, but it has meaning, and it makes us feel secure. And so,
and it's lost.
Yeah. And so, I would just recommend to people, the best thing you can do when somebody's going through a loss is just to listen and to say, I'm here, and hold their hand. And, if it's a loss of a person or a pet, sometimes people like to be able to talk about that person or their pets, and, to just to listen and to say, I'm sorry, and the other thing is, let me know if you need anything, is not as helpful as, I'll be over Thursday with a casserole, and you don't have to talk, or we don't have to hang out if you don't want. I'm here if you want, but I'm just going to, you know what? I'm going to pick your kids up from school on Friday, just thinking things through for you, because you're so overwhelmed and with trauma that you can't sit down and make a list of everything you need people to help you with.
It sort of feels like that's a little bit game of hot potato. Like, I get to be generous and say, oh, anything you need, just call. And then the hot potato is in your court, and I've done the nice thing, and now it's up to you. So you're kind of almost burdening the person with the need to come up with the request.
Yeah. And that's how I felt, like it was my responsibility to reach out, which is really hard to do when, it's really hard to call someone and be like, I hate to bother you, but can you please help me pick up my kids? Or, it's hard to do. So there were some friends that were like, they just organized a clothing drive for my kids, because we had no clothes. We had hospital gowns. So they organized a clothing drive at my kids' schools, got their, shoe sizes, their clothing size, and just did it without being asked, and that was like, oh my God, thank you. Like, I couldn't have done that at that time. I was still injured and had burns, and, so that kind of a thing. But I also, again, want to recognize both sides of it. I think most people that say that, they really mean it, and they just don't know what to do. They're like, I don't know what to do, how to help you. Tell me how to help you. So I don't know if you can be creative and think of just like, if I were in that situation, what's something I would need to do?
What would I want?
And
then clear it and make sure that person wants that too.
Right.
The other thing that I think that happens, and I know that I experienced this, I lost a pregnancy very late in the pregnancy, and it was a pregnancy with twins. And so it was certainly a tragedy and horrible and awful. And I noticed that certain people could be there and certain people kind of couldn't. And I at first it hurt my feelings and all that. But I also realized that some people are so afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing, that they don't know what to say. So they think it's better to say nothing at all. And they're not being jerks. They just kind of don't know. They're so afraid to say the wrong thing. And I always tell people, the best thing you can say is, I don't know what to say, honey, but I'm here and I love you. I mean, I don't know what to say. Please, you don't have to have the perfect witticism or the perfect sage wisdom for somebody. Sometimes all you have to do is do a load of laundry for them, or
exactly,
or just say, I love you, I'm here, and
exactly.
That's it.
And I always tell you, Betsy, I don't know how you survived going through that. So difficult. I also had a miscarriage years ago, and I wrote about it, and the story went pretty viral, because what I was writing about is the fact that miscarriage is such a taboo subject in our society. And women don't tell anyone that they're pregnant because what if it doesn't stick? And then, oh God, they'd have to let everyone know that they had a miscarriage. And women tend to internalize miscarriage and blame themselves for it. And it was something I ate or something I didn't eat, or I didn't rest enough, or I rested too much. It's like you blame yourself. You feel ashamed of having a miscarriage. And like if you had a family member pass away, everyone's going to be coming over with casseroles and to sit with you and to sit Shiva if you're in that, if you're Jewish. If you have a miscarriage, everybody just dissipates. Nobody in my family called me when I had a miscarriage. I mean, my children did, but everybody like dispersed, and it was like, oh God, don't say anything to her. It's so awful. It was very lonely.
I called it the secret sorority. Exactly. I called it the secret sorority because it was sort of like all of a sudden by having a pregnancy loss, I was a member of a club that I didn't even know existed. And then certain women that I had known for decades came out and said, oh, I lost a baby too, or my sister lost a baby, or my mother lost 3 babies. Or I thought, oh gosh, I'm a member of a club that I didn't even know was so extensive, and a club to which many of my acquaintances belonged. And I didn't even know it.
Yep.
It's kind of amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And when I wrote that piece, I have never gotten more emails and feedback and comments ever from anything I've ever written than that miscarriage piece. It was like so many women around the country were like just dying to tell somebody what had happened to them. It was incredible.
Well, that makes me think of that. This is a quote I've said before on this broadcast, but that Sue Monk Kidd said, and she said, there's no pain on earth that doesn't crave a benevolent witness.
Yes.
And I think about that, and I think, sometimes I didn't really necessarily even want somebody to come and tell me things. I just wanted them to be with me.
Exactly.
And even if they were just being with me on the phone. So after fire season, this was 1994, so some time ago, what do you think you did to get through that? What got you through the rough moments? And what lessons did you learn?
So, what's funny is that for about 15 years after the fire, like once there was a 4-year period, which is detailed in fire season, where it was like, we just couldn't win. And then things started to turn around, and then I started to change my attitude. And so that's what I wrote about, is coming out of this slump and how I pulled myself out. Once we pulled ourselves out, I ran so far away from that experience in my life and did not look back over my shoulder. I didn't even want to think about it. And what I didn't realize is that by not looking back, I was missing out on so much of the lesson, and I was harboring the grief, pushing it down. And so I was in a writing workshop, and for the first time ever, I tried to write an essay about the night of the fire. And when I got up in front of, 20 women in this writing workshop to read it, I was shaking so hard I couldn't read it. So my writing teacher, who was Amy Friedman, she had to read it for me. And then she asked me to stay after. She's like, meet me for coffee. Let's go talk. And so we sat down, and I told her, I can't face this. It's too scary. And it literally made me start shaking and, having the same feelings I had that night. And she said, this is not an essay. This is a book that you need to write, and your life is not going to change. Because I was starting to go through another weird depression slump and all that. She's not going to change until you write your way out of it. You have to write your way out of this. And there was just like that moment where you get chills when somebody says something to you and you're like, crap, she's right. And so I faced it, and I took a couple years, and I literally went in the basement of my house, and I dug out all the journals. I kept journals through that whole time, and I dug out the journals and reread them and started taking notes. And it was so hard to revisit and so painful. But what I realized is that there were these really beautiful, tiny moments that happened in the middle of disaster. And, I call it, I think this, I call that my lily pad moments, because I was thinking about how, lily pads bloom in the deepest muck of the pond, right? But the pond is dark and the water's murky underneath. And I felt like I was just in rereading my journals, I was realizing these tiny little beautiful moments with my children, with my husband, in music, in art. Those were these little tiny lily pads. And I was stepping from one of those to the next one, just to get through and not fall into that murky water, which was the depression, which was constantly there. Because I did fall into a suicidal depression, because the tragedy of the fire and the loss and all of that broke open all this other trauma from my childhood that I had never examined, so it was like this just perfect storm of trauma. And so it was these tiny lily pad moments that were my saving grace. And it was just, I came home one night and the lights were out in the house and the cars were in the driveway, and I walked in and I knew our electricity had been shut off. We were so broke. And I just thought, my God, I started to fall apart. What am I going to do? I knew the kids were home. And then I looked out the back window and Troy was back there. He had lit a campfire. He and the kids put a tent up and they were playing camp songs. And it was just this beautiful moment that came out of a horrible situation. And that's what we did. When we were too broke to buy groceries, we were like, kids, we're going to have pancakes for dinner. And they're like, pancakes for dinner, so fun,
A lot of that's going on right now in the middle of the coronavirus crisis that we're in, that people are having to find moments, you call them beautiful tiny moments or lily pad moments, having to find those. And we're seeing them posted online, and we're seeing kids that are doing dance parties and families meeting via Zoom and neighbors being generous and people. I just learned just last night that, and I haven't yet experienced it, my sister did, that in Marin County where I live, that at 8 p.m., everyone's going out on their balcony or in their yard or whatever and howling like wolves so that everyone's got giant howl going on, and it gets the dogs howling, and it's supposed to be this spectacular thing. So I'm gonna be putting that out. That's like this little beautiful moment. I don't even know the names of all my neighbors, but I'll howl with them. That's kind of cool. So I'm thinking that those little lily pads, a lily pad, not only does it grow out of the muck, but if you can't get from one shore to the other in one jump, it lets you get there in one step at a time, doesn't it?
It completely does. And that's one of the most important things that I've been doing is I've been taking daily hikes and just, seeing nature and the balance in nature and how everything comes back. And we had fires here, horrible fires a year and a half ago. And the growth, like beautiful, like the morning glories are actually growing wild and wrapping themselves around charred dead trees, and the mustard fields coming up around the charred areas, and poppies growing where they never grew before. And it's such a good reminder to me that this too shall pass, and nature brings everything back into balance. And during this time, that we're all stuck at home. I mean, I was sort of, when we were so, as I called it, broke, we had to find we couldn't go out really much, because we couldn't afford gas, and our cars were always breaking down. And, so we would do picnics in the living room, and we would put a big picnic blanket out. We'd have a picnic basket, and the kids thought it was so fun. We'd do picnics. If it was raining outside, picnics in the living room. If it was sunny, we'd do a picnic on the back, grass. We rented movies from the library that were free. We'd have movie nights. We just looked for, we did jigsaw puzzles together. We played board games. We did the things that didn't cost any money and didn't require us to go anywhere. And it really was kind of a beautiful time in the middle of all this disaster. And I feel like that's what many of us are finding now. I had Zoom dinner with my adult kids and my 14-year-old, who's obviously still living at home. And I thought, my kids only live in LA. I live in Chatsworth. We're an hour apart, but we usually only see each other once or twice a month. And I'm like, gosh, this is great. Why don't we do this every Wednesday? Like have a Zoom dinner together. It was so fun. So I think there's a lot to be found in this.
In prior generations, during the Great Depression, when people had so very little, they had to find ways to make things work, right? They had to make their dolls out of corn husks. That's what they did. And I think that we can take those lessons and learn them. And Hollye, I want to switch our conversation away from this just a bit, just as we march toward our close here, because originally when you and I were going to talk, I was focused on your activism, and you've been such a mama warrior for sensible gun laws and for education around safe gun law. This is not anti-gun in terms of the anti-Second Amendment folks. So those of you who own guns or have them and deal with them responsibly, that's not what we're talking about, but trying to prevent guns from being in the hands of folks that shouldn't have them, or the kinds of guns that we just simply don't need in society. So that activism has got to be sometimes amazing, but sometimes really discouraging.
Yeah.
Really hard, because the opposition and red tape and complication and money against it is so huge. Those are all such huge elements. And I'm wondering where you get the determination to keep going, to keep advocating even when things don't work.
Yeah. My children, your children, everybody's children are what motivates me. And, again, I had this trauma from my childhood of my 7-year-old brother being shot in the head by a teenager neighbor that we had known all our lives, who just snapped one day. My brother survived with a bullet in his brain and lives to this day with a bullet in his brain. My best childhood friend, who's still one of my best friends to this day, years later would become also a gun violence victim when her husband shot her 5 times in front of her 2 and 4-year-old daughters, in front of their daughters. She had last rites read over her, and she remembers being unconscious, but she could remember her thoughts thinking, I have to get to my girls. I have to get to my girls. I can't let him get my girls. And that's how she survived. And that's why I do this work for my kids and your kids. And when Sandy Hook happened, my brother was that age when he was shot. My youngest was that age when Sandy Hook happened. And all of the things that I had never talked about really, came bubbling up. All the memories of me holding my brother bleeding out in the backseat of the car while my mother ran red lights to the ER. And him looking up at me before he passed out and saying, please don't let me die. That could be a really big motivator for me. The fact that that's haunted my whole life. Please don't let me die. And I was 14, and I think I've shouldered that responsibility ever since, but I hadn't done much other than writing about gun violence until Sandy Hook. And then I was like, look, I'm a good citizen. I've never missed a vote. I go out and I march for, peace and things like that. But I was terrified to call a senator's office or go to Washington, D.C. or even go here to my local legislators' offices. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to talk to those people. But I was like, well, you better get over it because kids are dying. So whether you know how or not, just start doing it. And I did. So that's sort of the motivating force there.
I think that Sandy Hook, the tragedy of that, was a motivator for a lot of activism. And what inspires me about that, Hollye, is, and maybe it's just as relevant to what we're going through right now, that some people are capable or choose to, or find the strength to turn their heartbreak into heroism, to instead of folding up and going inward, they say, you know what, this is just my call to get over whatever hesitations I might have and to do what I know is right.
Yeah, like all the women running for office, right?
Oh my gosh. Well, and I think it's true, not just in the area of gun violence, but you're seeing people now who are taking to YouTube and opposing what the administration is saying, nurses and doctors and healthcare educators and other legislators. You see people that are putting on masks and helping their neighbors. You see people that are just digging deep and doing it. It's sort of, like you said, you have to get over yourself sometimes, whatever deficits you think you have, or nervousness or self-consciousness that you think you have to kind of put that aside for the greater good.
Yeah, you definitely do.
And to know that you can do that is a big deal, isn't it?
It's a huge deal. And really what I learned in the first meeting I ever took with a legislator, it was a congressman here who was, had a gun hanging over his desk and all of this. And I was really intimidated to go in and talk to him. But what I realized is he didn't even know as much about the background checks bill that I was talking to him about as I did. I had to explain it to him. And these are just people. And a lot of them are people that don't really know much more than you do, believe it or not, and they rely heavily on their staffers. I think we're getting some really great people in office now. You look at people like Katie Porter, like smart as a whip. But a lot of them aren't. And they by good luck or a lot of money behind them, they got into that position. But a lot of them, they really rely on their staffers. And when you're making calls to like a member of Congress's office, their 21-year-old interns are answering the phone, and all they're doing is checking a box for this issue against this issue. And people are so nervous to make that call. That's it. That's all you're doing, So anyway.
You're just registering your vote in a way. And I think of that as voting after you vote. You continue, whether your candidate or your issue wins or loses in any election, you can continue to register your voice.
Exactly.
In writing or in calling or in marching or in doing whatever.
And in the beginning, what we were told continually by legislators is we're like, why aren't you moving on this bill? Or why aren't you? Well, we don't hear from you guys. We always hear from we hear from the NRA people constantly. They call our offices all day long, every day. They're the squeaky wheel. They get the attention. We don't hear from you guys. So now, I think they're hearing from us guys a lot, but back then nobody was calling.
That's pretty inspiring, Hollye. Well, I'm excited to have you today and to celebrate your book, Fire Season, My Journey from Ruin to Redemption, to look forward to your future novel, Better Off Without You, and to thank you for the activism that you've done on behalf of my kids and the kids of everyone else. I really appreciate that.
And if I can have one moment to thank you, because I listen to your podcast every week, and it's one of the uplifting things I do, and it's one of my lily pad moments.
Thank you. My conversation with Hollye Dexter today brought all kinds of inspiration. She's such an innovative and creative person in 1,000 ways that you didn't get to hear on this. And if you read her book, Fire Season, you'll find out all about that. But in terms of the extra blooms today, in terms of this conversation, there are two things that really stand out. And one was that when Hollye realized she sort of wasn't looking back, she wasn't really talking about the experiences that she'd had. She wasn't talking about the traumas that she'd endured. And that by doing so, she was depriving herself of the lesson or the lessons that could be learned there. And I wonder how many of us protect ourselves. Sometimes we need to, and that's okay, but sometimes we're protecting ourselves when in fact there are good things to learn from looking back. Of course, if a memory is traumatic or you have residual post-traumatic stress disorder as a result, you probably want to do this exploration in the company of a professional who knows how to help keep you safe to do that. But even in our everyday lives, I don't want to miss out on the lessons. And sometimes that takes a little work. I'm also struck that Hollye used a floral metaphor. And obviously, as the host of the Morning Glory Project, I'm a fan of those. And hers were something she called the lily pad moments. Those little lily pads that grow out of the mucky swamp, but float so beautifully on top of the water. She thinks of those as those moments that you can restore yourself, the rest from how things that are hard, the blossom that comes from things that are difficult. I really like that. I have often said to folks, sometimes it's hard to jump from one bank to the other, from where you are to where you want to be. And I've often thought of lily pads as little stepping stones that you can use to get across murky waters. But for Hollye, there are also moments of beauty. I rather like that. So while you're tucked inside, perhaps still safe from this coronavirus, or maybe when you're listening to this, it's all over now and you're remembering it back again, I hope that you'll remember these extra blooms, that you'll seek them, and that you'll bloom right where you are. Thanks for listening to the Morning Glory Project. Stay safe, stay well, stay connected.